Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on in. What we're going to talk about today is logical fallacies, and um, we're going to get to something called formal logic coming up next, where we can analyze things like arguments and statements and look at things in a very precise way, like you might expect in a math class. Um, but I think it's really helpful to sort of know, what the reason is that we're studying logic before we get too in depth in all the details. And I think that talking about logical fallacies is a good way to motivate that. Um, Fallacies are forms of reasoning that are not valid. Okay, so this is reasoning, and the fallacies that we'll talk about is reasoning that we'll often run into in real life. These are very common, but they're not valid, which means that if somebody follows that reasoning, they have no reason to expect the conclusion is true based on the premises. Okay, and some of these fallacies we'll be able to look at using symbolic logic, and some of them you can't really. You just kind of have to talk about why they're fallacies. So let's just go ahead and jump right in and start looking at what these things are. Okay, so first let's define our terms. An argument that is not valid is called fallacious. Okay. Um, a type or a form of invalid argument is called a fallacy, or sometimes you could call it a logical fallacy. Okay, so that's the thing that we're really looking at here. What is a fallacy? Okay, and our opening statement here is that it's an argument that is not valid. Okay, and there's lots of them out there. There are many different types of logical fallacies. Okay, so we'll just go over a few select ones, but before we go into some specific examples, what we're going to do is maybe talk about some categories of fallacies, like how would you even group them together. Okay, so the easiest fallacies to spot are when we're using deductive logic, because deductive logic, everything is very straightforward, right? The conclusion must follow, right? It's guaranteed from the premises in deductive logic. Okay, so if that doesn't happen, if there's any case where that doesn't happen, it's obviously wrong. Right? Okay, so the easiest ones to spot are when we're using deductive logic. So, okay, and we'll look at those later. We can analyze those with symbolic logic very effectively. Okay, we'll also see a few inductive fallacies. Okay, those are a little bit more complicated, again, because inductive reasoning is not quite as straightforward. The conclusion doesn't always have to follow for the reasoning to be valid. Okay. The most common kind of fallacy that we're going to encounter, though, is called a rhetorical fallacy. Okay, and we often run into those in the media, or maybe when you're, discussing ideas with a friend or something like that. Okay, so let's go over what these are to begin with. So we're going to organize our rhetorical fallacies, and we're going to divide them into three categories. Okay, now these categories aren't important; they're just to help us sort of organize things. Okay, you're not going to be tested on what these categories are. Okay, we just want to sort of understand what is a fallacy and what is not. Okay, so first we have fallacies of relevance. Okay, these are not valid because they have premises that are not related to establishing the conclusion. Okay, and we'll get to examples of these in a minute. So I'm gonna maybe first talk about the categories, and then we'll get into some examples. Okay. Then we have fallacies of misinterpretation. Okay, and these fallacies are not valid because ideas are interpreted differently in the premises than they are in the conclusion. Okay, so in the first one, our premises don't connect to the conclusion, right? We make an argument, maybe the premises are true, we argue this thing, but the premises aren't really related to the conclusion. In the second one, what we're doing is we're saying, all right, I have ideas in the premises and I interpret them one way, or maybe I use a word that has one meaning in the premises and I use a different meaning in the conclusion. Okay, so that would be, the idea behind misinterpretation. And then we have fallacies of sufficiency. These are not valid because the premises are not enough to establish the conclusion. Okay, so maybe they're connected to the conclusion, okay, and we're not misrepresenting anything, but they might not be enough to give you the conclusion. Okay, so let's look at some examples, and that I think will hopefully really clarify what we're talking about here. Okay, so let's start with the fallacies of relevance, and there's many different ways that this can show up, right? So it's not like a fallacy of relevance is that's a category. Okay, all right. So remember that when we have these fallacies of relevance, the premises are not related to whether or not the conclusion is true. Okay. So here's an example. You shouldn't take Jason's tax advice. He cheated on his wife. Okay. It may be true that he cheated on his wife, right? That's a premise. And the conclusion is that you should not take his tax advice. Okay. But that premise isn't related really to his tax advice, right? His fidelity in his marriage isn't really going to be a good indicator of his knowledge of tax law and whether or not he can, understand the system and fill out the forms or what have you. Okay, and this is a really, really common logical fallacy. It's called an ad hominem or personal attack. Okay, so in this type of fallacy, in an ad hominem argument, one claims that a statement is false, okay, because it came from someone who's, in some way bad or unreliable. Okay, so because Jason cheated on his wife, he's a bad person, so you shouldn't take his tax advice. Okay, that's the idea of the argument, but again, his tax advice isn't really related to that. Okay, so that's not a good reason for not taking his tax advice. All right, here's another example. This multivitamin must be good. My math teacher recommended it. Okay, this is kind of like the same idea, but on the other side of things. Instead of saying that something, instead of saying you should not do this thing because somebody who's bad or unreliable said it, it's going the other way. It's saying that this thing is good or true because it came from somebody that is reliable or good or that you trust, right? So in an argument from authority, one claims that a statement is true because it came from someone good or reliable. Okay. And I will tell you, as a math teacher, if you ask my opinion on mathematics, I can tell you what's going on. Okay. And I'm, there's good reason to trust my statements about mathematics. Okay. But that doesn't translate over to multivitamins. Okay. My opinion, I think, is probably just as reliable as anyone else's. And, you shouldn't trust something just, about multivitamins that I say just because I said it, right? So this is the idea of argument from authority. What we're doing is we're saying that a statement is true or more likely to be true because of who said it. And what we should be doing is looking at, well, what, do we have any good reason to believe this thing? Or what are the arguments for it? What are the reasons? Okay. All right, in both of these cases, the facts about the person must not matter to the claim. Okay. So in the first example, if we said you shouldn't take Jason's tax advice, he cheated on his taxes, okay, that's not a personal attack. Cheating on your taxes is relevant to tax advice. Maybe you would look at that and say, you know, I think that the way that he does his taxes is maybe, you know, dangerous, or, you know, that would give you a reason. It's related, okay, to the tax advice. Okay, cheating on his wife is not. Okay. So in the first example, it would also be different if it were marriage advice instead of tax advice. Okay. In the second example, right, you know, if I say, you know, this multivitamin is good, my math teacher recommended it. If instead of your math teacher, if it was, say, like your doctor or a nutritionist who recommended it, then again, that's relevant, right? If your doctor recommended it, that would not be an argument from authority, okay, the logical fallacy, okay? That's saying, oh, this person is an expert in that field, right? They have specific knowledge, so when they recommend something, it's based on their knowledge of that field. Okay. All right, let's look at another example. Quantum physics must not be true because it doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so you say, well, this thing doesn't make sense, so it must not be true. Okay, and again, that's a logical fallacy. This is the label that we're going to give to this one is the appeal to incredulity. And in this case, someone claims that a statement is false because it's confusing or unexpected. Okay, and when we talk about quantum physics, it's maybe easy to understand why somebody could get confused about that, right? Like, that's okay. I could say that's a difficult field of study to understand. If I haven't spent time studying physics, right, then it being confusing makes sense. But people apply this in a lot of different areas, right? When they say, okay, if it doesn't make sense, it must not be true. That's like a common argument to hear, but just because something is confusing to one person doesn't necessarily mean the thing is false. Okay. All right, here's another example. Learning math must be important because otherwise I'm wasting my time studying for a math class. Okay, this one's a little bit more subtle. Okay, in this case, what we're doing is called an appeal to consequences. And an appeal to consequences, a claim is true because if it were false, something bad would follow. Or because if it were true, something good would follow. Okay, so what you're looking at there is you're saying, okay, you know, I'm claiming this thing is either true or false because of what it might lead to. Okay, and that's not necessarily a good thing either. The consequences of an action aren't really, or of an action or a statement or an idea, aren't a reliable way to test and see whether that thing is true or false. Okay, because other things could be impacting that. And you know, like, you know, wasting your time with a math class. Just because you decide to study something doesn't mean that it's important. Okay, math's important for other reasons, but all right. Let's look at another category of logical fallacies, the fallacies of misinterpretation. Okay. So in these logical fallacies, one must misinterpret or misrepresent the premises to reach the conclusion. So let's look at some examples. The judge said televising the trial was not in the public interest, but the public was very interested in viewing the trial. Okay, so when we look at these fallacies of misinterpretation, we have to be careful. It's usually specific word usage that we're playing off here. Okay, so when we say the term public interest, okay, that's different than the public is interested. Okay, when we say the public is interested, what we're doing is we're saying okay, people are, some people want to see the trial. The public interest is talking about maybe the general good, okay, of society, right? It's not looking at what specific people want. It's saying what's good for our population as a whole, okay? And so those are two different things, right? Talking about specific people wanting to see something and whether it's good for all of society to let people see that thing, those are talking about two different things. So public interest has a different meaning here in the premises than public interested has in the conclusion. Okay, so this is a logical fallacy called equivocation. Okay, so an argument relies on equivocation if a key term has a different meaning in the premises and conclusion. Okay, so in the example, in the public interest means good for society. Okay, it does not mean that it's interesting to the public. All right, here's another example. Let's say person A and person B are having a debate. Person A, women's pay should be equal to men's for the same job. Person B, person A thinks that men's pay should be cut, but I think everyone should get paid the salary they negotiated for. Okay, so again, this one is sort of a trickier or subtler thing, right? So we have to be a little bit careful about what's going on here. What this is called is a straw man argument. And when one argues against a straw man, one makes up a weaker version of an opposing argument. Okay, so for example, person A said women's pay should be equal to men's pay, but they didn't say that men should get a pay cut. Okay, person B sort of invented that pay cut as being part of person A's argument because that makes it easier for them to argue against. Okay, this is a really common thing, especially in politics. Okay, where you're talking about what another group wants. Okay, so if I'm opposing a group, okay, and I'm coming up with an idea, or I want to say, maybe this candidate is bad, I talk about what that candidate believes in, and when I say what they believe in, it's usually not the same as when they say what they believe in, right? And this is sort of the way that we can highlight that, right? This idea of a straw man, when we want to argue against an idea, instead of arguing against it as it is, we weaken it somehow. Okay. All right, and that's bad reasoning. All right, let's look at another one. All math teachers are extremely polite. If you think you've ever had a rude math teacher, they're not a real math teacher, just someone who happens to teach math. Okay. All right, and this one, the labeling for this, I'm not sure what it originally came from, but no true Scotsman, right? So the no true Scotsman fallacy claims that every member of a group has some property by excluding any member that doesn't have that property. Okay. So what you're doing here is we start off by saying that all math teachers are extremely polite, and I might have an idea of what math teachers are, probably people who teach math. But later on in the argument, when we say, okay, if someone is rude, they're not a real math teacher, okay? So what I'm doing is I'm sort of changing my definition for what math teachers are. I'm saying math teachers might be the set of people who teach math, but we take away the people that I don't want to be part of that group. So my definition has sort of changed here in the conclusion than it started off here in the premise, right? That's why this is a misrepresentation, okay? All right. Let's move on to fallacies of sufficiency. So remember, in In a fallacy of sufficiency, the premises are not enough to get the conclusion. Some important premise is missing. Okay. These can be, again, a little more subtle and difficult, but we'll look at some examples that hopefully highlight what we're talking about here. So here's our first example. We all agree that college students shouldn't waste time and money on a lot of useless classes. Therefore, the number of credits of humanities required for graduation should be decreased. Okay, so when we look at our premise here, right, if we say we all agree college students shouldn't waste time and money on a lot of useless classes, okay, I might look at that and say I agree with it. Okay, now in our conclusion though, we bring up humanities and we're like, wait, maybe humanities are really important to me. Okay, maybe not. But it's sort of changing things again. And what we call this is begging the question. Okay, one begs a question when a key point of the argument is included as a premise rather than being supported by the argument. Okay, so when we say we all agree that college students shouldn't waste time and money on a lot of useless classes, I'm using that as a premise, but that's really what I'm trying to conclude, right? If I'm trying to conclude that the number of humanities credits for humanities should be decreased, I've sort of assumed part of that as one of my premises. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm not making a good reason for why I have this conclusion. I'm trying to get you to assume the conclusion along with me. Okay, so probably whoever thinks humanity classes should be required doesn't think they're useless. Okay, so if we say, if I made the argument, we all agree that college students shouldn't waste a lot of time and money on a lot of useless classes, also humanities classes are useless, therefore the number of credits for humanity for graduation requirement should be decreased. Okay, then that would be better reasoning, because if you agree with both of my premises, then the conclusion should follow. Okay, all right, but we're sort of missing that key point. Okay, begging the question is a really common term to hear when talking about reasoning, especially when talking about when people make a mistake. We have to be a little bit careful though. When people say beg the question, when we talk about it as a logical fallacy, that doesn't mean raise the question. Okay, so when you bring up a question, that's not begging the question. Okay, so begging the question is this logical fallacy where we include a key point of our conclusion as a premise. Okay, so we sort of assume something that's part of our conclusion. Okay, let's look at another example. If you're not with us, you're against us. Okay, this is called a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when we assume that two things must be true. Okay, sorry, one of the two things must be true, right? It's either this or that. Okay, you're either with me or against me. But there might be other options. So, for example, you know, well, okay. And anytime we in an argument say you should believe this one thing because this other thing you don't agree with, right? You know, we should look at, is that really all the possibilities? Okay, are there really just those two options? Okay, you know, if I say to my kids, you need to get to school. You know, if you don't go to school, then you know the police are going to come and you know, arrest me for truancy, and you know, the whole family will fall apart, right? That's probably not the only other option to going to school. All right, here's another example. I can't let you turn in your homework a day late because soon nobody will be doing any homework until the last day of the semester. Okay, and again, this term is one that you'll commonly hear referred to, right, like in media or things like that, a slippery slope argument. Okay, so a slippery slope argument claims that an action shouldn't be taken because it leads to further actions. Okay, but without extra evidence. So we have to be careful about this slippery slope, right? The idea, again, right, if we look at our example here, the argument is that I can't let you turn in your homework one day late because soon nobody will be doing any homework till the last day of the semester. Well, I didn't really give reasons why suddenly everybody's going to stop doing homework, and I also didn't give reasons why a one-day extension is the same as waiting till the end of the semester to do any homework. Okay. So these are things that might, you know, come later if people are, get lots of extensions on homework whenever they want it. Maybe they might abuse that, but you could make an argument there. But here, that's all missing, right? We're just saying, okay, we have this one thing, and we have these terrible consequences, okay, but we didn't give any connection between them. We didn't sort of, you know, draw a line between giving you a one-day extension and the whole system falling apart. Okay, so that's this idea behind a slippery slope. And again, this is you know, bad reasoning. This is a logical fallacy. Okay, these logical fallacies that we talked about today, okay, these were all rhetorical fallacies. Okay, and rhetorical fallacies, I think are, you know, again, these are all things that come up often, that you'll often see or hear. They're harder to be very careful about. They're more difficult to clearly show that this is a problem. Okay, you sort of have to pay very close attention, you know, to you know, the words in an argument and what's going on there. Okay, the fallacies that we're going to spend more time on in the class, okay, are just a little bit easier to study. So when we look at deductive fallacies, okay, those are very easy to show that they're fallacies. Well, relatively, okay. We'll set up a framework for demonstrating that things are fallacies, and we'll be able to do that for inductive a little bit. Okay. Rhetorical fallacies are much more difficult to study in depth, but it's really important, I think, when we talk about logic to be aware of these and to see, okay, this is stuff that happens and this is bad reasoning. Now, again, a fallacy doesn't mean the conclusion is false. Okay, so you know, if I look at this example here, maybe you agree that the number of credits for humanities should be decreased. Okay, maybe you think that's a true statement, and you also agree that college students shouldn't waste time and money on useless classes. Okay. But that doesn't mean that this is a good argument for changing the humanities credits required for graduation. Okay, so you can agree with a conclusion, but still say that an argument is bad and not valid. Okay, you can say, all right, we should find a better argument for this. All right, that's logical fallacies. What we're going to do next week is we're going to start getting into what's called formal logic, where we can break things into pieces and help use that to simplify things. It's what we do in mathematics all the time, right? The way that we solve an equation, you don't look at an equation and just guess at the number. You take steps to break things down and help you figure out what that number is. We're going to do the same thing to arguments. We want to be able to break them down into pieces. So if I look at an argument and I can recognize that it's a slippery slope, then I can say, okay, that's a bad argument. But sometimes it's not as clear. And so that's what we're going to be doing going forward. We're going to say, how can I break things down so that I can be careful and deliberate about whether or not an argument is valid or invalid, and does this reasoning make sense? Okay, so we'll get to that next week. I'll post up some homework. Let's see, it's Friday. I like to give at least a full week for homework. So, our due dates might be a little bit off next week. Okay, exams sometimes throw things off. But this should give us, something to think about, and once we get some homework, something to work on.